By way of introduction, I am working here at IWP as a research assistant. I'm also an MA candidate here, and I am mostly interested in propaganda, disinformation, and influence. And the idea for this lecture is provoked by some events that I observed in Poland that were described in a very particular way in America. And I reckon that there's a need for information on the topic because some things look totally different on the outside than they look from the inside. And the question I wanted to ask is whether NATO Centers of Excellence are a security threat. It might be a daring statement, and I understand it's controversial, especially that I'm not military. However, I would like to prove my point. So, due to the changes in the NATO structure related to the fact that the Cold War is over and we need to meet different needs, NATO is transforming. It is changing also by means of inventing new structures, and centers of excellence are one of those structures. However, what we need to remember is that NATO does not directly fund centers of excellence, and they are not a part of NATO command structure. This is very important. Even though the NATO Centers of Excellence are units that have access to crucial information for NATO, and like the center in Poland may provide counterintelligence materials to NATO, they are not in the NATO's chain of command. So NATO Centers of Excellence have a number of functions, and their activity covers a wide variety of areas. The point is to provide expertise and knowledge needed by NATO, but not to double the responsibilities of the two structures. So NATO tries to have some sort of its core activities, whereas to me it looks as if it was outsourcing a part of capabilities to centers of excellence and other units that are affiliated with NATO but are not directly dependent from it. So the Allied Command of Transformation, which is a NATO body, has the overall responsibility for the centers of excellence, and while they are waiting for accreditation, it supervises them. So NATO makes sure that the center of excellence is prepared well for functioning, then it accredits the center of excellence, and then they cooperate. What is also important is that centers of excellence needn't be the unit which is solely dependent financially on one government. They can be funded by more than one government. The center of excellence we are interested in is the Center of Excellence in Poland, whose main aim is to provide counterintelligence on the region of Eastern Europe. As you may imagine, in view of the conflict in the Ukraine, which is now considered a frozen conflict, and in view of the increasing activity of various countries on the internet, which is sometimes called a cyber war or information war, counterintelligence is of primary importance to NATO. And this counterintelligence center received media attention in America on the 18th of December when the head of the center was replaced in a very particular manner that is going to be discussed later on. However, even though the situation was unusual and the head of the center was replaced in the middle of the night, which is not a very good PR move for the Polish government, there were reasons for those actions. And what I really want to stress here is the fact that we have cultural differences between the US and Europe, not to mention the post-Soviet part of Europe. Because in Europe we have a different sense of time. For instance, for us 70 years is not a long time. In America, 70 years, it's much more in your subjective sense of time. So whatever was happening in Poland 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50, 60, 70 years ago, that is during the Second World War and afterwards, is still alive to some extent. Not only because people remember, but also because people who participated in certain events are still involved in the politics and different structures of our country. So this is of primary importance, especially if we deal with some matters related to the NATO security, to realize that actually you cannot imagine that the phenomena that happened in America can be translated into the European language and vice versa. In case of Europe, you always need to know history of the country, you always need to know a lot to be able to understand the things that in America could mean completely different things. So to focus on our Center of Excellence, although it is ultimately supposed to be based in Krakow, which is here, possibly due to the cooperation with Slovakia, which is here, it was very quickly mounted in a temporary location in Warsaw. When you look at the distance between Krakow and Warsaw, it is half of the country. Here in America, people are used to traveling. For you, the 4-hour distance between New York and Washington is not a big deal. In Poland, it's a much bigger deal. People live in small cities or cities which are relatively not large in comparison to America. The capital has around 1.2 million people. So in comparison to the American scale, it's a totally different thing. So even though it might seem a reasonable distance for an American, for a Polish person, it might be strange. Why the temporary location of the center that is ultimately supposed to be in Krakow is Warsaw? It's rather far away. So the center is supposed to be working soon. It was mounted very quickly. It was planned since 2014, and as I have already mentioned, it is supposed to be a cooperation between Poland and Slovakia, mostly with other European countries contributing to the center. In view of the fact that Slovakia is one of the countries that tend to support the biggest country in Europe, which is not a NATO member, that they have extensive and increasing military cooperation with that big country, and that they have closer and closer economic ties, it was interesting for me to see that the Poles and the Slovaks are supposed to work together and provide NATO with counterintelligence, even though separate policies of those countries are favorable to a non-NATO member, at least in terms of military cooperation. The aim of the Center of Counterintelligence is to detect counterintelligence threats, but also to work on joint counterintelligence strategy and doctrine. This means that because NATO outsources certain duties to the center, they are going to work on it. So you have an outpost of NATO in a part of Europe which is quite exotic still for the NATO members, that is cooperating on the counterintelligence doctrine of the whole NATO. So
this is totally essential for the American public to be well informed about how people in that part of Europe think, what is important for them. It's not only about the Poles or the Slovaks, it is about the whole region as such. When I read newspapers in America that perceive somehow the events in Poland, I can see that the crucial information is missing. And how crucial this information is, I am going to show in my next slide. So this outfit, which is still waiting to be finally accredited by NATO, is staffed, which is quite understandable to everybody, by the members of military counterintelligence service that were especially delegated to do that. And the head of that counterintelligence service was the former deputy head of military counterintelligence service. So it was an important person in the structures of the military counterintelligence that was delegated to do equally important job in the NATO Counterintelligence Center of Excellence. But what I didn't see in any newspaper in America, and what I was not able to read anywhere else than on different Polish websites and sources such as, for instance, the archives of our parliament, where you can read each and every statement of every MP that has ever been asked, is that military counterintelligence service in Poland had special prerogatives. Apart from the standard counterintelligence activities, so to say, like crime prevention in all the agencies dependent on the Ministry of Defense, protection of classified information, protection of Polish army abroad, counterintelligence activities, and protection of scientific research, it also enjoyed some particular rights. As you can see, the military counterintelligence service is a special service of our Ministry of Defense. This means they are not a part of the army. They are an agency that is subordinate to the Minister of Defense. It's an organ of government administration, and it is important to remember for the rest of the presentation. So the particular prerogative I was talking about was given to this counter-military service in 2006, and by way of a bill of parliament, they were authorized to cooperate with special services of other countries. Of course, this required separate procedures. The Prime Minister had to be notified. He was supposed to authorize the cooperation after consulting the Minister of Defense. And as long as this, and as far as this permission was concerned, it was really vital that everybody who is important knows. However, this privilege of our military counterintelligence was abused. Apparently, which can be read in many newspaper sources, a secret agreement was conducted between Poland, Polish counter-military service, between military counterintelligence service and a special service of a big country, which is a non-NATO member in Europe. So our counterintelligence was cooperating with intelligence of a non-NATO member of considerable influence in Europe. This agreement was made public only later in a special parliamentary report, and to the knowledge of our press, it was stamped, rubber stamped, retroactively by the Prime Minister. This means that for 18 months there was an uncontrolled, ongoing cooperation between the counterintelligence of a NATO member, Poland, and a non-NATO member. Polish authorities were not informed about that, and NATO authorities were not informed either. 18 months. So as you can see on the picture, the cooperation I mentioned was multifaceted, and it lasted despite of the fact that the conflict in the Ukraine took place in the period of the cooperation. Professional training of staff and senior officials was conducted outside of the territory of Poland, also in the capital of the big country, which is a non-NATO member. And an uncontrolled communication channel was created, which was not known to the NATO members and their authorities. Visits of the representatives of the foreign services were taking place at the Polish counterintelligence seat in Oczki Street headquarters. And when those visits were taking place, the visitors were not registered in the visitors log. No ID, no official ID pass was issued to the representative of their services, and they entered the premises in an unchecked vehicle at least once. When a Polish MP issued an official inquiry to the Minister of Defense at that point, asking how come all those facts are taking place. It was a larger inquiry concerning the functioning of the Polish counterintelligence services in general in the period between 2008 and 2013. The minister responded that because counterintelligence's activities are secret, he is not able to respond to the MP's inquiry. Although the inquiry specified the things I mentioned above, that is, cooperation with the services of a non-NATO member. As you can see, the members of the Polish counterintelligence were visiting St. Petersburg between 10 and 13th of September 2013. And the pictures you can see are the officials of that service visiting the ship Aurora that was known in the Russian history. They have the traditional outfit, traditional uniform of Russian sailors, I believe. So this picture is self-explanatory. And in October 2015, in Poland, the government changed. So all the people that were involved in the management of the counterintelligence services were no longer in power. Everything changed. And after 2 months, we could read here in America that Poland ousts head of NATO training center in nighttime raid. Because what happened was that the new Minister of Defense decided that because the officers who are responsible for the soon-to-be accredited Center of Excellence of NATO do not want to report to him and refuse to report to him, saying that they are subordinate to the NATO chain of command, he is going to intervene directly. So this title, Poland oust head of NATO training center in nighttime raid, was mentioned in a couple of variants in all the American newspapers. They would say that either it was a new government, either that this was a minister of defense, either that it was a political decision, and there were all sorts of narrations that focused on the nighttime raid and unexpected raid, unexpected intervention. However, nobody was asking question, why was this done? Everybody assumed that it must have been a political move. Nobody thought that it might have been a rational decision. So this is why I decided to have this lecture. I had this introduction about what the centers of excellence are, what their role is, what their meaning for NATO is, and who was employed. The people who were in touch and in cooperation and who were trained by a non-NATO ally. And those people were just before the government changed, because the new center, as you remember, was very quickly mounted in a temporary location. They were delegated to the center where they could act unsupervised, at least in theory. Because if they managed to build the relationships with the NATO forces, they would have their support in NATO. They would build their own lobbying, and then it would be much more difficult to replace them if need be. So the conclusion of the night raid that was so widely discussed in American newspapers were different findings. For instance, it turned out that the whole facility was totally unprepared for counterintelligence activities. It was because location was temporary. There was not enough security on the spot. Even the documents or ID passes for the government officials were found in unsecured drawers and chests, or just on the desks of people working there. So can you imagine an office of counterintelligence service where which you can just visit and pick documents from drawers or from desks, or just take a look and see what somebody has on his desk? Then the infamous photograph was found. The photograph I used on the previous slide was one of the documents that was found there. In the soon-to-be accredited NATO Center, one of its employees had all documents, including photographic souvenirs of the visits of the counterintelligence members to the famous cities of our non-NATO member. And last but not least, the most symbolic discovery was made in the office of the head of the center. The Polish coat of arms, official state symbol, was hidden behind a blind or a curtain, whereas the emblem of FSB was displayed on a prominent place. So this is the background of the story, which was described in America as some sort of government raid on an independent NATO facility. However, when you dig deeper into it, you discover that actions that are described as irrational or as prompted by the greed of power were in fact quite well justified. Of course, in terms of public relations, the nighttime raid is never a good thing. However, in this case, I believe it might have been a security precaution. What is very important here is that people who are employed in the Center of Excellence believe themselves to be immune to the Polish state administration. They believe that the moment they enter the NATO structure, they must no longer obey the traditional chain of command. Of course, we may assume it was some sort of a confusion on their part, and I would be very happy if it were the case, but maybe it was not a confusion. So when analyzing the situation in all the post-Soviet countries, we have to be very sensitive to the fact that the situations that have certain meaning to us in America needn't have the same meaning in other countries and other cultures. Well, my experiences as a Pole is that history plays a much more important role in everyday Polish life than it plays in everyday American life. I haven't heard so many people in America referring to the times of the Second World War as if it was yesterday. Some Poles do believe that the history was yesterday. There is a lot of unsolved topics in Poland, and this is a country which is undergoing change. So, in terms of becoming a reliable ally, it needs to be closely observed. And I mean here full understanding of the situations. Because what I was talking about was based totally on the information I found in the Polish press. So if you are interested in finding out what people in a given country think and how they see the situation, you cannot just resort to the American media, because the journalists nowadays, they are not so diligent. They go and buy press releases from official press agencies, and they rarely bother to look deeper into the matter. Whereas in every country you have a number of bloggers that are trusted, a number of Facebook sites that inform people totally independently, and different newspapers, not only the ones that support the government, also the ones that are against. In some countries, the situation is not very balanced. You have very few anti-government sources, but you can always find them. So what NATO has to be very conscious of is that the situation in various countries of Europe need to be closely monitored. It doesn't really mean that you have to devote a lot of money to it, because how much does it cost to have one Polish-speaking person observing Polish sites? It's not that much money. You may have this person here in America, this might be a cooperative in Europe, but you have to have some sort of counterbalance to the official narrative of newspapers. What I found here in America is that newspapers tend to follow one trend, whereas all the information that is crucial to the future of NATO is out there. So how come I did not find one mention of any kind of FSB relation in this case? Why not one journalist was interested in the fact that the nighttime raid was maybe prompted by some rational decision? We are always very quick to jump to conclusions, especially about foreign nations. We sometimes assume that they are like us. And the reason why I put the picture of the mirror is because I believe that sometimes we are our own biggest enemy, because we assume so much. We interpret situations through the prism of our own perception, and we fail to look for information which in the long run may create the risk to the whole alliance, as well as to the stability of various crucial operations. Because if we cannot trust one another inside the alliance, how is it going to transform, and what is it going to transform into? Thank you. Any questions?
Are there centers of excellence in other countries in NATO?
Yes.
Or?
Yes, there are many centers of excellence, and they usually have various prerogatives. So this Polish center is especially interesting because this is a counterintelligence center, so it's like a very sensitive topic. But there are other centers that deal with training, with providing information that has to be outsourced locally. For instance, lately a center in one of the Baltic states produced a very extensive report on the way that Russia is dealing with the conflicts in the Ukraine and how it initiates various activities on the internet. This is a first-hand knowledge. Those are people who live in those countries, who experience that, who have the historical knowledge that allows them to interpret things correctly. So the point of my presentation is not to undermine the centers of excellence as such. Quite to the contrary, I believe that they are a very important source of information. However, what we have to be sensitive to is the bias, our own bias, and we have to look for information everywhere. I suppose we should have NATO counterintelligence vetting everyone in NATO. We cannot forget that when the structure is morphing and the balance in the world is changing, our own military protective structure, because the aim of NATO is to protect all the countries, all the NATO members, may change too. We are not immune. Even when we look at ourselves in the mirror, we are not immune to ourselves. So my main point is that we need information, and we have to look for it more extensively than Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. Yep.
So what do you see as the future of the Center of Excellence in terms of moving forward with accreditation and cooperation with Slovakia?
It is NATO. NATO oversees the preparation and NATO gives the accreditation. So it looks as if they were training the people with whom they are later on to cooperate, which is very reasonable. However, I believe that this stage of training should also be accompanied by vetting. And one of the news that was available in press is that the center in Poland was mounted hyper quickly. That normally the process takes up to 2.5 years, and they were ready with it in below a year. So whenever somebody is extra diligent, we always have to ask ourselves the question what the reason for it was. Because maybe it was diligence, and maybe because it was the oncoming change of government that would counteract certain plans that they had. You never know. Of course, now the situation has changed, and a new party is in power in Poland. They have a different approach. But every time something changes, you have to monitor. Because it's funny how, imagine that there was this center working with our non-NATO member to produce counterintelligence doctrine for the whole NATO. And this source would be considered genuine and benevolent. Sorry if I scared you. Yep.
So what precipitated Poland and Slovakia's decision to establish the Center of Excellence? Because you've mentioned that it happened very quickly.
Well, it's hard for me to judge. I know that the plans of such a center were on the spot since 2014. It was more than those two countries involved in preparations because a number of Baltic states and Southern European states were also supporting the idea, as well as Italy. However, unless we ask people who are responsible for the quick operation, you will never know. I believe that this was maybe diligence or the will to impress our ally. You always want to make a good impression. But maybe there were also some other motivations. The task of the analyst is not to say who was right and whose intention was, and what the intention was. The aim of the analyst is to show that you may have this intention or this or this or this. Anything else? Yes, Dr. Theo.
Yes, thank you. I came in late, I'm sorry. I think the first part of your lecture I talked about earlier. Somebody in this country has called the alliance obsolete. You probably have heard of him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that that characterization could also be extended to the centers of excellence? Would they be considered, if they're dangerous or if they're risky, could they also be considered obsolete? Or would you refrain from that? Rather,
I think it's a very I think it's a very good question.
oh, you do, I didn't think so.
And I suppose that this is the question that the people more authorized to ask it in the NATO structure should ask themselves. Because as I already mentioned at the beginning, the NATO is in the process of transformation. And the transformation assumes that NATO is going to limit the extent of its military activity. This is why they are aiming at preserving some core activities and capabilities, but they are outsourcing things like counterintelligence to units that are not funded by NATO. So I can see here the attempt at cutting costs. However, I'm not a military member, of course, but I suppose we have to always ask ourselves the question when we cut the budgets, that will it pay off in the long run? So I think that the only question is about the aim of NATO, because in view of the changing geopolitical situation, possibly the direction of transformation should be modified. But it's hard for me to judge in what direction. I don't think the centers of excellence are obsolete, but for sure, the fact that they are not vetted and not observed, but only taken for granted as allies, may create some problems. Because it's good to have trust between the allies, but many theorists of international relations say that alliances are always tricky things. Have I responded to the question?
Oh, I thought you were saying something to me.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering if I responded to the question.
You certainly did.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate hearing it, especially because I'm not terribly familiar with the subject, but I can certainly appreciate maybe some of the things that are glossed over in such news sources as your statement, Wall Street Journal, etc. My question, I guess, pertains to that maybe even post-NATO future, or a future, as you said, in which the trajectory of NATO has changed significantly. Do you think that Poland, it's in Poland's best interest to establish partnerships that may even be outside? I know this is kind of the question of the lecture, but outside of kind of the realm of the formal treaty structure. For instance, I know that there's a group of Central European countries, not all of whom I believe are NATO participants, and I think they're called the Visegrad group, or
Visegrad.
yeah. And so if you could just speak to maybe that post-NATO future a bit more, I'd be very interested to hear.
Well, I really hope there is not going to be any post-NATO future. I do believe that we need the alliance, because for the last 6 years it was working well for Europe. I believe that this structure was needed and is still needed. My question is maybe as to the direction in which it goes, because we can assume the goodwill of all the partners of global relationships or all the partners in Europe. However, in view of the facts, we always have to modify the direction. It's difficult to say how to react, but for sure, if we have a frozen conflict in Europe, we have gradual taking of Georgian area by a neighboring country. It's like a willful activity. So if there is a willful activity and a big country in Europe says directly that NATO is a threat to its foreign policy and the aims of its policy, of this very policy, would it be wise of us to just dissolve NATO? But being more precise about your question, I think that it always makes sense to try to create groups of influence, because again, Europe is not like America. America is a huge country, and not countries in Europe. Some of the countries in Europe are much smaller than the biggest American states. So, especially the Baltic states during the Second World War or during the revolution in Russia, they experienced the direct threat because they are just too small. So I do believe that some groups of influence or some lobbying groups inside of bigger associations make sense. But the question is always again about the aim. As long as the aim is the functioning of the NATO structure and sensible development of NATO, they are good, of course. So I suppose there are no more questions. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.